Welcome on behalf of Music of the Baroque. This is Carl Grapentine, and today I have the great pleasure of introducing two very special people to talk about two very special composers. First, Sir John Eliot Gardiner, founder of the Monteverdi Choir, English Baroque soloists, Orchestra Revolutionaire Romantique, and president of the Bach Archive in Leipzig. And we welcome the music director of Music of the Baroque, Jane Glover, world-renowned conductor and musicologist as well. It's been almost 20 years with Music of the Baroque. He's conducted all the major opera houses in England, Metropolitan Opera, etc. But you can look up their bios if there's anything you're missing. We're going to talk about George Frederick Handel and Johann Sebastian Bach. They were born just 27 days apart. Handel was the older, and only about 100 miles apart, both in Germany, but they had such completely different careers. Of course, Bach and Handel are also the very backbone of Music of the Baroque's repertoire. And in having Sir John Eliot Gardiner and Dr. Jane Glover, we not only have two of the great conductors of those composers, but each of them has fairly recently written a book about one of the composers. John Eliot's is Bach, Music in the Castle of Heaven, and Jane's is Handel in London, The Making of a Genius. So we're going to talk about both composers extensively. We all seem to be hooked up. I'm in the Midwest of the USA. Jane is in London, and John Eliot, you're on the farm, which is how far from London?
It's about 100 miles. About the distance between Halle and where Bach was born in.
Very good, yes. Okay, let's start with Handel in London. As we mentioned, Handel was born in Germany, Georg Friedrich Handel, but he traveled extensively as a young man. What eventually brought him to London, Jane?
Oh, well, I think he had very itchy feet all through his early adulthood. He had been all over the place after Halle. He'd been to Hamburg, and he went to Italy for a couple of years and had huge success. And then he came back north again and he clearly thought he was going to have a bit of an explore. He went to Hanover, where he had a big invitation, and was then invited also to London. And you can see him thinking, well, maybe I'll go there for a couple of years and then maybe try Paris or Prague or Leipzig or Berlin or Vienna or who knows. But so he came to London, had a huge success in a very short space of time. Went back to Hanover because, of course, he was supposedly contracted there, but then there was this very complicated but very profound link between Hanover and London, which was about to become more explicit. And when he came back for his second visit, he effectively never left and stayed for 50 years. And mainly he was attracted by the theatre work that was going on, and he basically rescued that. I mean, somebody had tried to introduce Italian opera to London. They'd been playing with Italian opera in London and basically not understanding it because it wasn't quite good enough, and people were saying, well, why can't we have opera in English? And that didn't work, and so on. And Handel came and wrote Rinaldo, which is an unbelievable masterpiece, and the standards sort of shot up overnight, and he went on and continued to write opera, and eventually saw he could run an opera company in London eventually, until it didn't work anymore. But that was years later. I mean, opera in London lasted far longer than anybody would have imagined. Because of him. And then there was the other tie to London, which was of course, the royal family. His old boss, the Elector of Hanover, became George I here, and the rest we know. And incidentally, I just want to say that John Eliot's book has just a wonderful title, Music in the Castle of Heaven. I thought as you read out those titles that my title, Handel in London, was terribly prosaic. Wish I'd thought of something gorgeous like that.
You should have called it Handel in the Strand.
I should have. Well, somebody suggested that, of course.
Yeah. Jane, did you see a play years ago at the Greenwich or Blackheath called Handling Mr Bach?
Oh, no.
It was. I've been looking it up online. I can't find it. but I went to it. It was a play called Handling Mr Bach, and it was about an imaginary conversation between Bach and Handel.
Well, of course, this is the great encounter that never happened, isn't it?
It's a great encounter that never happened. And do you feel that Bach made a bit more effort than Handel? Do you agree with that? I think he made a bit more effort.
Probably, but he never tried to come to London.
No, and this is what the play is all about. It's saying, you know, Handel pitches up in Leipzig, and Bach greets him very courteously, as he greeted every musician who was traveling through Leipzig. And I'm sure Anna Magdalena put on the broth, and there was a wonderful meal and so on. And they were both good drinkers. I mean, Bach, we know, was a heavy beer drinker. You know exactly how much he drank in Halle when he was examining the organ there with Kuhnau. And in the conversation, of course, this is all speculative and completely fictitious. Handel says to Bach, I mean, is there an opening here for me? Might there be? And you know, I've recently been composing Messiah. Do you think that would go down well here? And Bach said, no, I'm afraid not. It really wouldn't go down well at all. You know, being in English, that really wouldn't go. But do you think if I came to London with my Matthew Passion, do you think that would go down well? And Handel says, absolutely not. The English wouldn't get it at all, not at all. And it goes on this conversation, ping pong, trying to upstage each other. And
keep them out of each other's territory too.
Handel had already traveled to Italy as a young man. Did he somewhat bring Italian opera to London, or was it already beginning to flow?
No, there was a lot of it here already, as I say, and it just hadn't quite been that sort of miraculous quality that he brought to it. Basically, it had no business to work at all. I don't know what you think, John Eliot, but you know, foreign stories sung by foreign singers in a foreign language.
Yeah.
Why should that work? You know,
it's so, the whole thing is so improbable.
Yeah.
I mean, there's Handel, brilliant genius that he is, writing these extraordinary pieces to an audience that only got a percentage of it. Surely they just. And I think there's a lot of snobbery, wasn't there? And a lot of kind of, you know, well, of course, this is the elite thing to do, rather than actually homing in on the substance of the music.
Absolutely, or the substance of the plot, even more so.
Exactly.
Which they could barely follow. I mean, we can say this, Carl, but as British people, but the English are not great linguists in general.
No.
And although there were parallel translations in the printed libretto of Italian and English, which was a sort of 18th century precursor of super titles, I'm pretty sure not many people would have followed those or cared. What people did become interested in, audiences did become interested in, passionately interested in, was the quality of the singing and the individual singers, these sort of rock star status people who came with massive salaries, which, by the way, I think they earned every penny of. And had whacking great careers on these stages, and took their massive earnings back to Italy and built palaces with them.
But why do you think? I'd love to know this from you, Jane. I mean, why do you think when he started off with wonderful English music as well? I mean, the Chandos anthems and Aces and Galatea. You know, why did that run into the sands, as it were, and not? It took it quite a long time before he switched to oratorio.
Well, I think that when he wrote the Chandos anthems and indeed Aces, and indeed the first draft of Esther, he was living out in canons in the countryside.
Yeah.
And there at the moment there was no opera in London, and it was just before he started to build the company that ran for years. I think this a little, you know, it had been running the criticism of why can't we have opera in English and why is it all foreign, blah, blah, blah. I think he was beginning to experiment with writing in the English language, and extremely successfully, I may say. I mean, Aces is a little masterpiece, is it not? I mean, it's just heaven. And and indeed the Chandos anthems show very sort of perfectly okay word setting, as we both know. I mean, his word setting in English is not flawless. If you look at his entire oeuvre, there are some wonderful howlers, but basically he always understood the language and always understood the gesture of the language and the affect, and he was just experimenting, as I say, with these early things. And then I think, do you know what I think? The turning point, in a sense, was possibly the 1727 coronation.
Yeah.
When he was asked by George II to write his coronation anthems, which he did, and not only did he set those wonderful words miraculously, but I think in discovering then, on this massive, majestic occasion, the ecclesiastical combined choirs of the Abbey and the Chapel Royal, that here was a choir of unbelievably competent singers who were used to singing counterpoint and really complicated music, and they could read, and the way that for generations and generations still do, choir boys and gentlemen of the choruses of the choirs just can do anything.
What I miss in the operas, wonderful that they are, is the chorus.
Yes.
And I welcome so much in the oratorios.
Absolutely.
And I mean, from every point of view, not just simply because it's textually more interesting, but also because he is such a superb writer for chorus. I mean,
yes.
Wonderful.
And as we can tell from the kind of choruses he wrote, most spectacularly probably in Israel and Egypt.
Yes.
But, you know, he could write for these choirs, which were based on the ecclesiastical choirs, these massive 8-part fugues and big double chorus stuff. And they could do it. And he knew they could do it. Of course, he would not have written it for them if they couldn't. And it's a great tribute to them.
One other thing, it's still fresh in my mind, the business about his word setting. I mean, there's some wonderful malapropisms and mistakes. And pretty well the only time I ever sat down and had a meal and talked to Nicholas Harnoncourt. He'd just been conducting Messiah in English. And he was saying, oh, you know, it's so wonderful to do it in English because Handel understood the English language so well. And it's so nice to get the right stresses where they are. For instance, incorruptible. And I said, but no, Nicholas, it's actually incorruptible. You're speaking it in the French way, incorruptible. We say incorruptible. No, you're wrong. Handel was right. It was incorruptible. That's what I've got to say. I didn't know what else to say.
Well, I know, and I once had a similar sort of conversation with somebody who I won't name, but whose name you know, about the setting of in Hercules of extravagantly, extravagantly, and it's fugal, of course, so it keeps
extravagantly gay.
Exactly, that's and this chap said, well, how do you know it wasn't pronounced like that in the 18th century? Well, come on. Extravagant.
Let's move on to Bach, though, for a little while. Most of his career was, of course, spent as a church musician. There were a few stints in there as a court composer, court musician, but the last 27 years, all in Leipzig, which seems to have been a very busy post, composing cantatas, rehearsing the choirs, teaching in the school, overseeing the other churches in town as well. There's sometimes an image of J.S. Bach as the humble, obedient Lutheran servant of the church. But John Eliot, how would you describe him from your research as a person? What was he like?
We have so few personal documents, so few personal letters. I mean, for instance, we know much more about Monteverdi's character because of his letters. There are only a couple of personal letters by Bach, really. Otherwise, they're either all to do with organs and organ registrations and the workings of an organ, or they're pleading on behalf of one of his sons who's got into trouble, or the one letter that stands out is the one that he wrote to Georg Neumann, who was his schoolmate in Ohrdruf, and he's then in Danzig in the north of Germany, and Bach writes to him and says, listen, do you have a post there for me? Because here in Leipzig, people have a rather odd attitude towards music. And my family can make a very, very good quartet or an ensemble, and we could all come very happily. Is there an opening? I mean, the whole idea of Bach actually going to Danzig and leaving Leipzig is preposterous. And you have to ask yourself, well, what was so bad about Leipzig? Well, I've already alluded to the fact that he was tricked into a contract which really was unfair and impeded him in many, many ways. And he had this incredibly powerful work ethic, as did Handel, but it manifested itself in a different way. And Bach certainly was both a good Thuringian and a very good Lutheran, and he wanted to serve the church. But he was casting pearls before swine in the sense that, I mean, this is a tricky thing, what I'm about to say, and Jane, maybe you can please come back at me if you think I've got it wrong. There's no shred of evidence as to how his cantatas were received. And can you imagine if you set yourself the task, which he did on arrival in 1723, to write 5 complete cycles of cantatas, 1 cantata for each Sunday in the church year. And that's not just 53 Sundays, because you have to subtract Lent and Advent from them, but you have to add in all the other saints' days for which he had to write a cantata. And then found that he was performing in a cold church, that the service lasted 4.5 hours, that the kids were, really, really stressed by the time the cantata came round. And then it came just before the sermon. And if you were a priest in St. Thomas's and you had to follow Bach's cantata, you must have felt a little bit redundant in some cases, because there is so much substance, both theological as well as musical, in each of those cantatas. And he had run-ins all through his life, Bach, from the first time, for his first posting, which was in Arnstadt when he was 18, and he had a run-in with a bassoonist. I mean, we've all had run-ins with bassoonists at some stage in our lives. I mean, he called a bassoonist a particularly ugly word. and was attacked by the bassoonist in the town square. And he had problems with town councils wherever he went. He had problems with the clerics wherever he went, who didn't understand him, or it's partly to do with the sort of divide between pietism and Orthodox Lutheranism, which is very complicated, and he sort of shuttled between the two. So he was, the only place that he was genuinely at ease and happy was in Köthen in the years that he spent there. I mean, in Weimar, he ended up in prison or locked down house arrest because he was serving two masters there. I mean, that was an impossible situation. You had an uncle and a nephew, both co-regents, co-dukes of Weimar, and you had to serve both of them because they had the same ensemble of musicians. But the uncle said to the musicians, if you play for my nephew, I'll shoot you, I'll string you up. And one horn player was killed. So, and Bach was looking for a way out. And as soon as he asked for permission to leave Weimar, he was put under house arrest. So I don't think he courted trouble, but I think somehow trouble courted him. Yeah.
And yet, I mean, you talk about the sort of unreliable quality of the people he had to work with, and yet, because of the complexity and miraculous sort of intellectual content of the stuff he wrote for them, they must have been able to do it, or he wouldn't have written it again and again and again, would he? He wouldn't have put in front of them stuff they couldn't do.
Well, don't you think it's like a lot of composers too? I mean, I don't do a lot of contemporary music, but the contemporary music I have done divides very sharply between composers who know exactly what they want and you can hear every note, and composers who are extraordinarily cavalier about what they've written and don't really hear what you're producing of their scores. Are
you suggesting that Bach didn't?
I'm suggesting that Bach had such an incredibly vivid internal hearing mechanism that if performances didn't measure up to that, yes, of course he heard it, but I think there was a sign that he had his eyes on the distant horizon, that he was in a sense composing for the long term, for eternity. And if a singer or a player made a nonsense of a passage, he would be very cross, just as he was very, very cross with his copyists who, if they didn't transcribe things correctly. I mean, there's one wonderful cantata on the cover of it, and this is Kuhnau's nephew who's writing out, and he wrote S Bach and spells it B-A-C-C-H. And there's a great big black smudge right across the page where you can see that Bach, just so furious with it, he just sort of gave him a clip round the ear, and there's the ink's flying everywhere across the page.
It is a pretty basic mistake to get the name wrong. The first insult.
Well, can you imagine how difficult it was for him to compose when in the Thomasschule, I mean, they were the party walls between the dormitories where the kids were sleeping and where his study, his Arbeit studio was so paper thin. And, and there were his own children, and Anna Magdalena was having a child every year. How he managed, I just don't understand.
Yeah, well, Mozart had the same. Mozart rather loved all that, though, didn't he? Remember when he was he loved musical environments where you could hear a bassoon in one corner and a violin in another, and somebody warming up. He said it gives you lots of ideas, so he actually thrived on that.
Maybe Bach did as too.
But I'm really interested in what you say about this sort of this inner ear and sort of writing the perfect music, whether or not he thought his people would deliver it.
Well, the perfect example of that, of course, is Beethoven, not Bach or Handel.
Well, absolutely.
Beethoven couldn't. He's lost his hearing already in his 20s, early 30s, and forevermore. His vivid imagination of how his music was meant to sound, he retained, but the actual ability to clock it, to understand how it was being performed, eluded him completely.
Yes.
Did the average churchgoer in Leipzig have any idea what they were listening to at the time? I think the answer is no.
Well, I think it was
pretty obviously.
particularly grisly for him, because not only I've described it, it's a cold church, you have to wait a long, long time, but also the ladies of Leipzig tended to arrive, having done their toilet and also had their coffee, just before the sermon was to be delivered, because that was the key moment when you had to be there. And what did they do? They walked in during the cantata, most likely, which was immediately preceded the sermon. And being German, there was lots of bowing and scraping. Hallo, gnädige Frau, wie geht es Ihnen? How are you, my dear? And so on. So there was can you imagine the sort of hubbub? I mean, it must have been so frustrating for him to perform there. I mean,
one has to say the same, of course, was going on in London theatres when Handel's operas were going on. People came and went and talked and shouted. And
yes, but they lasted more than 20 minutes, whereas Bach had 20-minute slot to get his message over.
Yes.
And I'm certain that some of the, I mean, you asked Carl about his beliefs and about, was he just a servant of the church? Yes, of course he was, but he also had his targets. I mean, what he couldn't abide was hypocrisy of any form, or any form of backsliding in that way. And very often you find there are in the cantatas there's specifically angry moments which must be directed. I don't believe they're just in general just sort of spattered out. I think he obviously had some specific targets in mind, and they were directed at them. Probably town councillors. I mean, if you look at the bewigged members of the town council at Leipzig, which you see on the walls of the town hall, I mean, it's a rogues gallery. It really is. I mean, it's not totally beyond comparison with Donald Trump's cabinet.
Print that, Carl.
Print that.
I'm going to say you stopped me there. Sorry. One more thing about Bach, and we have to move on. You've alluded to the fact several times that how busy he was, how much responsibility he had. So he had to be very practical in terms of his composing. So what about the Mass in B minor? It wasn't really composed to be performed. Was it indeed a conscious effort to, sum up his career, to leave a document of the best of the best?
I think we'll go on speculating about that forever. I mean, the facts don't help us completely. He wrote the Missa, which is the opening movements, the Kyrie and the Gloria, in 1733, and that was for Dresden, quite clearly performed in Dresden. And then incrementally, he added movements thereafter, and both that were newly composed and also going right back to his early years. I mean, in Weimar, for instance, the Et Incarnatus, it goes back to a Weimar cantata. It's a miracle, and I don't want to unpick it. I just love it so much. It's extraordinarily diverse, and it is such a wonderful mirror to the man and to his beliefs and his ecumenicism, because I think he did understand Catholicism as well as Lutheran pietism and Lutheran orthodoxy, and it's a kind of ideal that he's fostering. Look, there's a bit, I'd love to hear what you have to say about this. To me, when they were both 21 or 22, and they wrote two phenomenal pieces. I mean, thinking of Handel writing Dixit Dominus in Rome in 1707, and Bach writing Cantata 4, Christlag in Todesmann. I mean, those are, by any standards, great works in their oeuvre.
Yes.
And they have a type of similarity between them in that they are incredibly vivid evocations of biblical texts. Handel really takes on board the whole wrath of the Old Testament God, and you feel that he's taken on Monteverdi's Stile Concitato he's understood.
Yes,
I mean, he was like a sponge. He just loved Italy, and he loved everything about Italy, whereas Bach was being a good Thuringian, was a stay-at-home, he loved he was incredibly au fait with French music, he was au fait with Italian music, but not a traveller, whereas Handel was essentially a man of the world.
Yeah.
But they could come, these two works could come from two neighbours, two geniuses, such as they were, and be so powerful, and there are points of contact. I just wondered if you'd compare those.
That's fabulous to make that point. Do you ever perform them together in concert?
Yes, I have done.
Yes, that's.
And it's a question which order you do it, because Handel's is the more brilliant piece. It's a more multicoloured, extravagant piece, but Bach's is more profound.
Yes. Well, I might just pinch that idea.
Do.
Eliot. It's a brilliant. Yes.
Dixie, Dixie.